Hi, welcome to our channel where we share the most intriguing stories. When a battle-hardened Navy vet seeks peace on a quiet lake, he finds war instead, not on foreign shores but in his own backyard. Armed with grit, honor, and an old patrol boat, he faces off against an HOA tyrant in a clash of history, pride, and one hell of a fight for respect. When I retired from the Navy, I didn't want fanfare. No big speeches, no parades, just peace and a damn good view. That's why I bought a modest two-story house on the edge of Lake Murray, South Carolina, a place where the only sounds at dawn were loons, wind, and the occasional outboard motor. The property came with its own dock, a sagging old boathouse, and enough space to breathe. More importantly, it wasn't part of any HOA. That was deliberate. After 20 years of rank, rules, and red tape, the last thing I needed was Karen with a clipboard telling me what shade of beige my mailbox should be. The centerpiece of my little slice of paradise was a decommissioned Navy patrol boat, a Swift-class relic called the USS Dagger. I'd spent months acquiring her through a restoration nonprofit. She wasn't armed, of course, just stripped down and sun-worn, sitting like a sleeping warhorse at the dock, waiting for someone to care again. I was that someone. Restoring her was my way of keeping a piece of history alive and keeping myself sane. Sanding rust, replacing wiring, scrubbing bulkheads. That was therapy. Cheaper than whiskey anyway. For the first 6 months, nobody cared. The neighbors were friendly in a polite, wave-from-a-distance kind of way. I liked that. I wasn't looking for potlucks or pool parties. Then the house next door sold. The U-Haul showed up one Monday morning, and with it came Karen Bentley. Tall, tidy blonde in the Waybox dye makes you believe in lies, wearing an HOA badge around her neck like a sheriff's star. I introduced myself. She smiled, but her eyes didn't. The kind of smile you see before someone tries to sell you overpriced siding. A week later, it began. I got a typed letter in my mailbox. Not mailed, just tucked in the slot like contraband. It read like it was written by a disgruntled English teacher. Dear property owner, your vessel constitutes a visual blight and contradicts the uniform lakeside aesthetic of lakeward shores. Please remove the vessel from public view within 10 days to avoid further action. Respectfully, Karen Bentley, HOA President. I laughed out loud. My vessel was 20 feet from her property line, tucked behind trees, and, again, not in their HOA jurisdiction. Still, I figured I'd be neighborly. I replied with a short, direct letter. Ma'am, the vessel in question is part of a federally registered historical restoration project. The property lies outside the authority of Lakeward Shores HOA. Kindly refrain from further unsolicited directives. Regards, D. Holloway. I left it in her mailbox like a peace offering with teeth. I figured that would be the end of it. I was wrong. But back then, I still thought I'd bought a home by the lake. I didn't realize I was parking on a battlefield. A few days after I dropped my politely sharpened note in Karen's mailbox, things got noisiest. Not from her directly, she's the passive-aggressive type, but from the sudden flutter of HOA-branded flyers that started showing up like unsolicited credit card offers. Laminated, of course. Very professional. One showed up on my gate, a high-resolution photo of the USS Dagger from a distance, captioned in bold red letters, Environmental Hazard, Community Eyesore. You decide. It listed some made-up nonsense about rust runoff and aquatic contamination risks. Another claimed the vessel was visibly lowering property values. I found 3 more taped to the public board near the boat ramp, and one suspiciously stuck to my truck windshield like a passive-aggressive parking ticket. I ignored it at first. Just noise. But then a neighbor named Todd, who up until now had only ever waved from his kayak, stopped by while I was replacing some weather-stripped hatch seals. Hey man, he said, keeping his eyes on the boat like it might explode. Just wanted to say, I think what you're doing here is cool. Not everyone does, though. Karen's been talking to folks. Stirring the pot. I nodded. She's got a real flair for drama. She mentioned I'm not even in the HOA. He laughed awkwardly. Yeah, but she says the view affects the whole community. Her words, not mine. 2 days later, a white pickup with state plates pulled up out front. A guy in khakis and sunglasses stepped out with a clipboard. South Carolina Department of Natural Resources. I greeted him with coffee and my best don't mess with me veteran smile. He was polite enough. "We got a complaint," he said, eyeing the dagger. "Something about hazardous waste from the hull." I let him inspect everything. No leaks, no fuel, no signs of pollution. The thing was drier than a Mormon wedding. He even complimented the preservation effort, took a photo just for records, and left with a shrug and a handshake. Case closed. That same night, I saw Karen outside talking to a small group of neighbors, gesturing toward the water with the body language of a woman narrating a local tragedy. She spotted me watching and smiled, saccharine sweet. The next morning, a new flyer appeared on my gate. "Is your family safe near that boat? Demand answers now." I started installing cameras. It wasn't about paranoia, it was about pattern recognition. When people start acting like you're a threat, they either escalate or retreat. Karen didn't look like the retreating kind. No, Karen was just getting warmed up. It was a Thursday night when the line got crossed. The day had been quiet. Too quiet in hindsight. I'd spent the afternoon sanding the deck rail of the Dagger, earbuds in, sun low, and the wind off the lake crisp enough to take the edge off the heat. Karen hadn't made a peep all week. No flyers, no complaints, no sideways glances from HOA drones. I should have known better. Calm is just what comes before the shot. The first thing I noticed the next morning was the smell. Faint, but sharp. Fresh paint. I walked down to the dock, coffee in hand, and there it was. Bold and ugly across the portside hull. "Eyesore, remove now." The letters were uneven, jagged, but unmistakable. Neon orange, like construction hazard tape. Just below it, sloppily stenciled, HOA, and the date. Like a signature from a vandal who thought they were Michelangelo. For a second, I just stood there, coffee going cold in my hand, staring at the defaced steel like my brain couldn't quite accept what it was processing. And then I turned and walked back to the house, slow, controlled, and rewound the camera feed. There she was. At 2:17 a.m., Karen Bentley, dressed in black leggings and a fleece vest, scaling the edge of my fence with a tote bag slung over her shoulder like some suburban commando. She crept down the dock, looked around like a cartoon thief, pulled out a spray can, and went to town. When she turned to face the camera for just a moment, I saw the smirk, the same smug grin she gave me when she dropped off that first complaint. Like she thought this was justified. Like she was making a damn statement. I called the sheriff's department. The deputy arrived around noon, a young guy named Rowley, who looked like he still had boot polish in his closet. I handed him the footage, the stills, the paint sample I'd scraped into a bag, and my original paperwork from the Federal Historical Designation Program. He didn't say much at first, just nodded a lot, took notes, and said, "Well, this is not your average property dispute." Then Karen showed up. Of course she did. Saw the patrol car and came over like a moth to a lawsuit. She was wearing pastel workout gear and holding a smoothie cup, like she'd just stepped off the set of a lifestyle blog. Without waiting to be addressed, she jumped in. "I want to explain," she said, brushing past me like I was the help. "That boat has been a point of tension for months. It's not a personal attack. It's a community issue." Rowley raised an eyebrow. "Ma'am, did you paint the side of this vessel?" Karen didn't blink. I was exercising my First Amendment rights. It's protest art. Besides, it's not even a real ship anymore. It's junk. My jaw tensed. It's a decommissioned federal patrol craft, and it's under historical preservation. "Sure it is," she said, rolling her eyes. "You say preservation, I say eyesore. The HOA has every right to demand its removal." Rowley cut in, tone changing. "You understand you entered private property and vandalized an object designated under federal preservation programs, right?" Karen's smile faltered for just a second. "It wasn't. I didn't damage anything. Just paint." "Paint on a federal artifact," I said calmly. "That's not graffiti, Karen. That's a felony." She turned red. "This is ridiculous. You're all overreacting. It's just a little message." Rowley held up the evidence bag with the nozzle from the spray can I'd found on the dock. "You might want to call a lawyer." She spun on her heel and stormed off, smoothie sloshing. I didn't even have to say a word. Watching her retreat across the lawn, I just stood there, arms crossed, heart steady. The dagger had taken hits before. One more scar wasn't going to sink her, but now it was personal. The moment that orange paint hit the hull of the dagger, it stopped being just my project. It became a battlefield, and I wasn't about to fight it alone. First thing I did that morning, after the cops left and Karen stormed off in a cloud of privilege and citrus protein powder, was call an old contact at the Navy Legal Service office in Charleston. Lieutenant Eric Wu, former JAG, now civilian counsel for the Navy's Historical Property Affairs Division. We'd served together briefly in the Persian Gulf. He once talked a drunk logistics officer out of a court-martial with nothing but a post-it note and a deadpan stare. If anyone knew how to handle this, it was Wu. I forwarded the footage, the photos, and the federal designation documents. He called me back within 2 hours. "Jesus, Holloway," he muttered. "She tagged a decommissioned vessel under the Department of the Navy's Historic Preservation Program, and she filmed herself doing it?" "Yep," I said. "Signed it too. Stenciled HOA like it was her damn art gallery." He exhaled slowly. "All right, I'll flag this up the chain. You'll need to file a formal federal vandalism report. We might even loop in the Office of Naval Intelligence. They handle external threats to historical assets." I chuckled. Karen Bentley, national threat. Never underestimate the strategic stupidity of bored civilians. He deadpanned. By that afternoon, I'd filed the report. That same day, a representative from the South Carolina Veterans Memorial Commission reached out. Apparently, word was spreading. The local VFW chapter had caught wind of what happened and wanted to support the restoration efforts. A retired Marine colonel named Diaz called me and offered to bring a team down for a volunteer cleanup. Meanwhile, the story started creeping into local press. The Lexington Lake Sentinel ran a front-page spread under the headline, "Veterans Boat Tagged by HOA President, Disrespect or Dispute." The online comments were a mixed bag, some calling Karen a vandal, others accusing me of weaponizing patriotism. But the tide was turning. A day later, I caught Karen planting more flyers at the community mailbox. This time they read, "Stop militarizing the lakefront. Reject weapons of war near our children." It would have been funny if it wasn't so desperate. The Dagger hadn't had a functioning weapon system since Reagan was in office. Her most lethal component at this point was a rusted porthole that liked to bite fingers. That night, I got an email from a woman named Colleen Washburn. She identified herself as the director of a Naval Heritage nonprofit out of Annapolis, said she'd read about the incident and offered support, both legal and media-related, should things escalate. Apparently, their donors didn't take kindly to people defacing Navy artifacts, decommissioned or not. Things were moving fast, faster than I expected. The next morning, while I was brushing down the railings, I heard footsteps on the dock. I turned to find a teenage boy, maybe 16, nervous, holding a small folded flag in both hands. "My grandfather served on a ship like this," he said, avoiding eye contact. "My mom said what happened was wrong. She asked me to bring this." Said maybe. Maybe it belonged here more than in a drawer. He handed it to me and ran back down the dock. I stood there for a long time, flag in hand, wind tugging at the edges, watching the sunlight glint off the spray-painted letters. That rusted hull had seen rougher waters, sure, but this wasn't about steel. It was about respect. For history, for service, for the line between private rights and public tantrums. Karen wanted war. Fine, I'd give her one. But mine came with evidence, allies, and chain of command. I've seen a lot of things go sideways in my life. Engine fires in the Gulf, weapons jams in the middle of drills, even a guy in my unit who once tried to hotwire a Humvee with a coat hanger. But I don't think I've ever seen anything spin so wildly out of control, so quickly, as Karen Bentley's grasp on reality. By the following week, her tactics had gone from passive-aggressive to full-on kamikaze. Flyers weren't cutting it anymore, so she went digital. I started getting screenshots from neighbors. A new online petition titled "Demilitarize Lakeward Shores, Remove the Boat." Underneath was a paragraph riddled with buzzwords like domestic threat, psychological harm, and trauma triggers. She even threw in a line about the lakefront being a sacred space for peace, not conflict reenactments. It had all the subtlety of a chainsaw at a knitting circle. Within 48 hours, the petition had racked up a few dozen signatures, mostly from her little HOA echo chamber. But what really made my blood pressure spike was the formal complaint she filed to the City Safety Board, alleging the Dagger posed a threat to national security. No, really. She claimed the vessel might still be armed, that it could contain military-grade equipment that violates civilian ordinance, as if I had a missile silo tucked under the deck next to my tackle box. And somehow, that lunacy got traction. Enough for someone at the board to pass the complaint along to federal authorities. That's when the ATF showed up. They weren't rude. They weren't even overly suspicious. But two men in dark suits showing up at your dock with badges will always set a tone. They asked to inspect the vessel. I let them. They poked through storage compartments, scanned the hull, checked for serial numbers and chemical traces. At one point, one of them held up a rusty old ammo box I used to store scrap wiring. "Not exactly an arsenal," he said dryly. "Nope," I replied, "unless you count solder and antique bolts." They wrapped up within an hour and left with a copy of my restoration permits and a handshake. No violations, no concerns. Just another day in the annals of wasted taxpayer dollars, courtesy of Karen's paranoia and a Wi-Fi connection. Later that night, I sat on the porch drinking a beer when Todd from down the road dropped by. He looked annoyed. Not at me. "You know she tried to get us all to sign some HOA emergency motion," he said, leaning on the railing. "Wanted to fast-track a vote to pressure the city council into declaring the boat a hazard zone." I shook my head. "Let me guess. Didn't go over well." About half the board walked out. One even called her unhinged on record. "She's pushing too hard, too fast. People are noticing." That gave me a sliver of satisfaction, but it didn't stop the fallout. Someone, I'm guessing Karen or one of her cheerleaders, mailed anonymous flyers to several houses, quoting lines from my Navy discharge like they were damning evidence. "Dishonorably retired," it claimed in bold print. Total fiction. I retired with commendations, but most people don't bother checking facts when the font's big and red enough. Fortunately, some did. A retired Coast Guard captain who lived 2 blocks over posted a blistering response on the community forum, defending me and calling the smear campaign a disgrace to the uniform and to every American who served. For every lie Karen threw, someone stood up. But she wasn't slowing down, and I had the distinct feeling that we hadn't seen the worst of her yet. I always believed that if someone's loud enough, long enough, eventually they slip, not just in logic, but in loyalty. Karen was no exception. She'd been running her mouth for weeks, and now it was catching up with her. It started with a knock at my door just past sundown. I opened it to find a man in his 50s, thin, wiry, with nervous energy, and the kind of haircut you give yourself in a mirror with clippers. He looked like he regretted being here the second I opened the door. "Mr. Holloway?" he asked, glancing over his shoulder like someone had followed him. "I'm Evan Reese. I used to be the treasurer for the HOA board." I stepped aside without a word. Something about his twitchy eyes and clutched manila envelope told me this wasn't a social call. "I've had enough," he said, sitting stiffly in my kitchen. "She's crossed the line too many times. We didn't sign up for this level of crazy. I tried to speak up last week. She threatened to sue me for defamation if I spoke to anyone outside the board." He slid the envelope across the table. Inside were printed emails, screenshots, and a typed memo that stopped me cold. Karen writing directly to 2 board members. "If we don't get rid of the boat, the community rating will tank. It already shows up on Google Satellite. People are asking questions. If you have to paint it to make a point, so be it." I flipped page after page. Expense reports showing HOA funds used to buy spray paint, stencils, printing services, all marked beautification supplies. A copy of a text to a board member. He's ex-military, probably has PTSD. The more we push, the more unstable he'll look. My hands curled into fists before I forced them flat. "She's not just entitled," Evan muttered. "She's weaponizing the HOA. And it's going to blow back on all of us." I thanked him, promised anonymity until the right time, and scanned every page for records. Then I made 2 calls. First, Lieutenant Wu. I forwarded the documents and said only, "We've got premeditation and financial misuse. Your move." Second, I sent copies to Colleen Washburn, the nonprofit director from Annapolis. 10 minutes later, she replied with one sentence, "We're going public." By morning, the Lexington Sentinel had a follow-up headline. HOA president encouraged vandalism of Naval Memorial Project, documents show. Underneath it, Karen's photo. Mid-speech, sunglasses perched on her head, mouth half open like someone caught her mid-rant. The community forums exploded. Half the comments were rage. The other half were mockery. One user posted a photoshopped flyer reading, "Help Karen defend property values from veterans and history." But it wasn't just locals. The story got picked up by a regional news station. That same evening, I was on the porch when a crew van pulled up with a camera guy and a woman in heels trying to stay upright on my gravel path. They filmed the boat, interviewed me, aired the footage under a banner that read, Naval Relic Defaced, HOA President accused of orchestrating campaign. The internet took it from there. Veteran groups flooded the HOA's website with angry messages. One even offered to hold a patriotic BBQ fundraiser on my lawn to raise awareness. I declined, but appreciated the sentiment. The final nail. A local senator's office reached out for comment. He'd served in the Army. His staff said he was deeply concerned about the desecration of historical military artifacts. Karen didn't just pick a fight she couldn't win. She declared war on memory, and memory fights back. Filing the federal lawsuit didn't feel like revenge. It felt like paperwork. A lot of it. Tedious, precise, clinical. But buried in those neat columns and citations was fire. I wasn't just going after Karen Bentley for vandalism. I was holding her accountable for weaponizing an entire neighborhood structure against one man and a damn boat. Lieutenant Wu handled most of the drafting. His team, along with Washburn's nonprofit lawyers, packaged everything. The video footage, the receipts from HOA funds, the flyers, the emails. They tied it together into a brutal summary. Targeted harassment, defacement of a federally recognized naval artifact, defamation, and emotional distress. Damages totaled to over $500,000. Normally, we'd settle, Wu told me over the phone, but not with this kind of evidence. We go to court. And we did. The case hit the federal docket faster than I expected, and it didn't take long for the media to latch on. The local news became regional, then national. I flipped on the TV one morning to see my face frozen mid-sentence on a segment called Veterans Memorial Boat at center of HOA firestorm. They played clips of the boat, the graffiti still faintly visible beneath layers of primer, while a panel of talking heads debated everything from homeowners' rights to historical preservation. Karen was silent at first. Then she did what all narcissists do when cornered. She doubled down. Her lawyer released a tone-deaf statement claiming Karen had acted in the interest of community integrity and that the lawsuit was an overreach of veteran privilege. That phrase, veteran privilege, set fire to everything. Veterans groups across the country went berserk. The American Legion published an op-ed titled, "When Did Patriotism Become a Nuisance?" The story trended on Twitter for 48 hours straight under Nollers Protect the Dagger. Even a retired Navy SEAL posted a video saying Karen Bentley wouldn't know honor if it was etched into her BMW. And then came the protests. Not mobs, just flags. Dozens of small American flags began appearing around my dock, the roadside, the mailbox. Some were from neighbors I'd never spoken to. Some were mailed from out of state. One had a note, "For the ship, for the man, for the silence that follows service." Karen's reputation cratered overnight. Local businesses cut ties with the HOA. The board held an emergency meeting to discuss leadership concerns. Several members resigned. One posted publicly, apologizing for ignoring the pattern of behavior until it became too loud to deny. Still, she refused to step down. At the preliminary hearing, her lawyer tried to paint me as overly emotional, accusing me of aggravating community tensions for attention. Wu calmly slid a photo across the table, the spray-painted hull, the HOA stencil, the timestamp. Then he played the footage again. Karen in the act, Karen smirking, Karen leaving like she'd just reclaimed Normandy. The judge didn't say much, but I saw it in his eyes. He wasn't just annoyed, he was insulted. Karen's motion to dismiss, denied, with prejudice. From that moment forward, the message was clear. This wasn't a neighborhood spat anymore. This was a public reckoning, and Karen was about to learn what real accountability looked like. The courtroom was colder than I expected. Not physically, just sterile. No grandeur, no drama. Just beige walls, a scratched wood podium, and a judge who looked like he'd seen enough of humanity to stop being surprised by anything. But even he blinked twice when Karen Bentley entered wearing a white suit that screamed, "I'm the victim here." She looked smug, collected, like she still thought this was a misunderstanding, like she could smile her way out of felony vandalism and public humiliation. Her lawyer shuffled papers beside her, already sweating. Mine sat with arms calmly folded, Wu next to him like a coiled viper in uniform gray. The opening arguments were short. The judge had already read the docket, the footage, the emails, the receipts, and wasn't in the mood for theatrics. Karen's side led with some limp rhetoric about community standards and emotional distress caused by a militarized presence on a family lakefront. The judge interrupted halfway through to ask if she was aware that the boat in question was not only legally placed but under federal historic designation. Her lawyer sputtered. Karen didn't look up. Then came the real damage. My counsel rolled out the timeline. The ignored warnings, the smear campaign, the use of HOA funds for what amounted to a late-night paint assault on Navy property. The courtroom watched the surveillance footage again, projected on a screen that made Karen's guilty smirk about 6 feet wide. You could hear her breathing on the audio. You could hear the spray hiss. There was no defense for that. Then we brought in the flag, the same one the teenager gave me, now framed in glass. I explained its story on the stand, how his grandfather served, how the kid brought it to honor the boat, how Karen had turned something sacred into a neighborhood spectacle. The prosecutor paused. Let that land. Karen finally broke silence when she took the stand herself. Her voice was icy, clipped, as she tried to frame herself as a whistleblower, the only one willing to defend the neighborhood's dignity. She called the dagger an aggressive symbol and claimed she feared it would invite undesirable attention. When pressed on why she took matters into her own hands instead of legal channels, she answered, because no one else would. That was the moment she lost the room. The judge's eyes narrowed. Ms. Bentley, you are not law enforcement. You do not have jurisdictional authority over federal property. You made that clear by tagging it with your organization's name. The verdict didn't take long. Karen Bentley was found guilty of willful vandalism of a federally protected object, misuse of HOA funds for unauthorized actions, defamation, and targeted harassment. The judge's ruling was sharp and exact. $250,000 in. Damages for restoration, $100,000 for emotional distress, $200,000 in punitive fines for desecrating a military artifact, and then the cherry on top. The HOA itself, under court order, had to post a public apology on its website and community entrance signage stating, "We respect U.S. veterans and America's military history." Karen's eyes were empty by then. Her lawyer sat slumped like a deflated balloon. The rest of the courtroom, silent. A few board members avoided my gaze entirely. One of them wept. As we left the courthouse, someone in the crowd called out, "Thank you for your service." I nodded, but didn't stop walking. This wasn't a parade. It was justice. And it wasn't finished yet. By the end of the week, Karen's face wasn't just on the news. It was a meme. Screenshots of her courtroom expression went viral. That blank stare, that perfect white blazer, now stained with loss. People started calling her Admiral HOA in comment threads. One post read, "She tried to sink a patrol boat, ended up sinking herself." Harsh, but not inaccurate. The fallout hit like a depth charge. First, her position. The HOA board held an emergency vote behind closed doors, but the result leaked within hours. She was unanimously removed from her presidency, not suspended, removed. No ceremonial resignation, no flowers and farewell speech. Just a notice quietly taped to the HOA clubhouse door. Effective immediately, Karen Bentley is no longer affiliated with the Lakeward Shores HOA leadership team. Second, the real estate. Her house, the one with the manicured shrubs and flagstone driveway, went up for sale within 3 days. Rumor was she tried to list it privately at first, but no local agents would touch the listing. Too much heat, too many cameras. Eventually, she went with an out-of-town agency. The sign went up crooked on the lawn. I'm pretty sure someone intentionally kicked it sideways. Neighbors stopped waving at her. One of them, a retired EMT who'd always kept to herself, started walking her dog a different route just to avoid the sidewalk out front. I never saw Karen again. Not in person, anyway. She moved out quietly one morning, shoved into a rental SUV with tinted windows. Her husband, who had managed to remain nearly invisible throughout the entire ordeal, was spotted loading boxes in silence. No goodbyes, no statements. Just silence and gravel crunching under tires as they drove away. I heard through a mutual acquaintance, Evan, the former HOA treasurer, that she moved to North Georgia, bought a condo near the mountains, a place with no HOA. The irony didn't even need commentary, but Lakeward Shores didn't just move on, it changed. The board elected a new president, someone level-headed, calm, and deeply aware of what unchecked power can do. They instituted reforms, Full transparency on spending, limits on enforcement actions, mandatory votes for any complaints involving non-members. It wasn't perfect, but it was something. People started speaking to me more, waving, stopping to chat. Some apologized, some didn't need to. One couple baked me a pie with USS Dagger written in frosting. It tasted like store-bought crust and redemption, and the lake was quiet again. Not because the fight was forgotten, but because the right side had won. And when the storm passes, peace feels earned. Restoration takes time, especially when you're working with a vessel that saw more salt than most humans do in a lifetime. But after everything, the paint, the trial, the politics, the Dagger was finally ready. Fresh hull plating where rust once lived, clean decks, polished brass. She'd never sail again, but she didn't need to. She was standing watch now, as a monument, not a machine. I raised the Navy flag that morning in full dress blues, not for show, but because I'd promised her. Promised that when she was whole again, she'd fly the colors. The breeze off Lake Murray snapped it open like applause. Just below the flag, I mounted a steel plaque. Hand-etched black enamel, 4 bolts sunk deep into the rail. USS Dagger, Swift-class patrol vessel. 1959-1997, decommissioned, preserved. Memory is duty. This boat served. This story stands. That weekend was the 4th of July. I didn't plan a spectacle. I'm not that guy. But word spread, and before long, my yard filled up. Vets in faded jackets, teachers with their students, parents with kids holding tiny flags. Someone set up a grill. Someone else brought a cooler of sweet tea. I lost count of how many people came down the dock to see the Dagger and touch her side like she was made of sacred stone. Around noon, a group of veterans from Columbia showed up with a folded flag in a glass case, an official presentation from their chapter. The man who handed it to me was in his 70s, tall, and walked with a cane like he was challenging the ground to move. "You didn't just protect a boat," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You protected what she stood for, even when it was unpopular. That matters. That always matters." He paused, looked out at the lake, then back at me. "You protected her again, just on a different front." I didn't have anything to say to that, not anything that would fit in words. So I nodded, took the case, and set it inside the wheelhouse where the light hit it just right. It's still there. Later that night, as fireworks bloomed across the lake, I sat on the dock with my boots off and my feet in the water. No courtrooms. No cameras, no Karen, just silence and stars and the creak of old wood beneath me. The boat, my boat, was safe. And for the first time in a long time, so was I.